Hello class, good day, and welcome back to Disaster Readiness and Risk Reduction, or SCI03. For today, we'll be having our continuation in course outcome number 4. Particularly, we're going to talk about the hydrometeorological hazards. Last meeting, we talked about typhoons as well as thunderstorms, but for now, we are going to continue our lesson on storm surge and floods. Starting with, of course, storm surge. As I mentioned earlier, or last meeting, or last discussion, a storm surge is a continuation or is a part of a hazard that a typhoon brings or a tropical cyclone brings. And as we described it earlier, when it comes to a storm surge, it is much like a tsunami, but instead of it being caused by an earthquake or an underwater volcanic eruption, it is caused by the sheer energy and the sheer water that a typhoon brings with it or a tropical cyclone brings with it. A storm surge class is also known in Filipino as the luyong ng bagyo. It is the abnormal rise in sea level that occurs during tropical cyclones. At normal conditions when it comes to our seas and their tides, there is a high tide and a low tide. This is true and this is actually observed in the daily weather report of Pag-asa. And we call the average of the high tide and the low tide as the mean sea level. Now, when it comes to a storm surge, aside from the low tide, high tide, there is what we call as the storm tide. The storm tide is a sea level higher than the high tide. How high? Well, it depends upon the storm surge itself. But a good thing to know is that a storm surge is a higher level of the ocean or the seas because of the amount of precipitation present during a tropical cyclone. In that instance, the high tide is no longer the highest point of the tide itself, but instead the highest point of the tide and of the sea itself is what we call as the storm tide. And that in itself is the storm surge that we are going to talk about today. And this is due to the energy and due to the sheer amount or volume of water present during a tropical cyclone. Now, when it comes to a tropical cyclone or a storm surge, there are three levels or four levels to consider. Pag-asa has devised what we call as the Pag-asa storm surge warning levels to determine the height of the storm surge itself and its corresponding impact to the communities around it. For example, the first part or the first level of the Pag-asa storm surge warning is what we call as the blue level, or it's less than 1 meter high of a storm tide, okay, or surge tide. So from the high tide, it's about less than 1 meter higher. This means there is minor damage to communities, coastal or marine infrastructures, and disruption to all marine related activities. And flooding is possible in low-lying areas. At this stage, we must be informed, or we are informed that there is a formation and the high tide is actually higher at this point. Now, at yellow warning level, it means that the storm surge or the storm tide or the surge tide is 1 to 2 meters higher than the high tide itself. Which means from the high tide, about 1 to 2 meters higher is the surge tide. Okay? At this point, a storm surge is possible. This is what we call as a storm surge. There's moderate to significant damage to communities, coastal marine infrastructures, and disruption to all marine-related activities. Flooding is also possible in low-lying areas. At this point, there is moderate damage to the communities. The next level is what we call as the orange warning level, which means that the surge tide is about 2.1 to 3 meters higher than the high tide. At this point, a storm surge is expected. Severe damage to coastal communities and marine infrastructures, as well as cancellation of all marine related activities. At this point, there is also significant erosion to beaches. Sand and materials that are in beaches will be brought down back into the ocean because of the waves formed in the storm surge. There is also the possibility of river flooding. The flooding is no longer limited to the coastal regions but also to the regions and the areas near river flowing or river flows. The last level or the last warning level is what we call as the red storm surge level or warning level. At this point, a storm surge is catastrophic, life-threatening and extensive inundation from rising seawater moving inland from the shoreline. There is extreme damage to coastal communities and marine infrastructures. River flooding is aggravated due to storm surge. At this point, not only are those communities in the coastal areas are affected, but also communities that are inland. Okay? And at this point, river flooding is also widely spread. Areas near rivers may experience flooding and may experience damages to their infrastructures or marine and water infrastructures. Those are the storm surge heights and and their warning levels based on the heights themselves with their corresponding impacts. So when we say there's a storm surge warning level orange, so it means there's a 2.1 to 3 meters high, and this is the possible impacts of that level. Now, when it comes to a storm surge, Pag-asa attempts to predict its impact. How does Pag-asa do this? Pag-asa considers three things. First, the strength of the tropical cyclone itself. Second, the height of the surge. And lastly, if the community is in a low-lying area. When predicting the negative effects of a storm surge, for storm surge prone communities, these are the things that Pag-asa considers. For example, the first thing that Pag-asa considers is the strength of a tropical cyclone, which we can see in the daily weather forecast of Pag-asa. Like in this example, in 14th September 2018, there was a typhoon named Ompong. At this point, Typhoon Ompong poses a serious threat over Cagayan valleys as it continues to move closer. There is a signal number 4 of Typhoon Ompong, which means that Pag-asa is considering the impact of the storm surge brought upon by such typhoon, which is signal number 4. Another thing that Pag-asa considers is the height of the storm surge itself. At this point, in the Pag-asa website, there was a storm surge warning number 2. In areas that are marked as red, there is a high possibility of a storm surge that is catastrophic. And this is the orange marked areas, and other areas are also included. At a storm surge warning number 2, there is a high risk of storm surge that may occur within the next 24 hours. The danger of life-threatening inundation from rising seawater from the shoreline moving inland in the low-lying communities in the municipalities of... Here we can see the list. Okay? So the second thing that Pag-asa considers when identifying the impact of a storm surge is the height of the storm surge itself. And lastly, Pag-asa considers or Pag-asa puts in the summary to determine which areas will experience a higher impact when it comes to the storm surge itself. For example, there's a red level or storm surge height of 3 to 6 meters in Cagayan region or in Ilocos Norte, particularly in Pagudpud. In Cagayan, in these following areas. There's a height of 2 to 3 meters in Ilocos Norte, in Bacara, Paway, Lawag, and Pasuquin. 1 to 2 meters in Isabela, Ilocos Sur, and so on. And there are no included countries, or sorry, no included municipalities or provinces in the first level. At this point, Pag-asa summarizes the impact of the storm surge itself by including areas or provinces that have their corresponding storm surge height. Which brings us to our next topic on storm surge preparedness. How do we best prepare ourselves when it comes to storm surges? During a storm surge and after a storm surge, we need to do the following. First, always be on the updates of tropical cyclone advisories, alerts or warnings through local news, TV or radio, social media such as Facebook and Twitter, and the Pag-asa website. Second, prepare at the earliest time your community that has been identified as a storm surge prone area. Identify the safest and quickest way to a high safe ground. What we can do is to determine which areas are prone to storm surges. If we are a part of that areas prone to a storm surge, then we should follow the following or do the following. Know the locations of concrete reinforced multi-story buildings designated by the local government for evacuation. Plan with family or friends living in higher grounds with whom you can temporarily stay with during the storm surge. Prepare to evacuate as soon as your municipal disaster risk reduction management council or your barangay officials advise you to do so. And lastly, evacuate. Should you be instructed to evacuate, do not forget the following. Bring your emergency kit and switch off the electrical power supply and gas tank. What we can do in storm surges is to identify areas that are prone to storm surge and to follow our evacuation procedures when and during there is a storm surge happening in these areas, or if we are a part of these areas that are prone to storm surge. Next topic is all about floods. Now, when it comes to flood, it is defined as a rise, usually brief, in the water level in a stream to a peak from which the water level recedes at a slower rate. A flood is what we experience in urban countries, or sorry, in urban parts in the Philippines. But floods are not limited to urban areas. Some low-lying communities are also prone to flooding. But we can tell that we are experiencing a flood if there's a collection of water to a point where the water level recedes at a slower rate compared to the addition of water from the tropical cyclone or the typhoon or the thunderstorm itself. Okay? Now, when it comes to flooding, there are many different causes. Natural causes include meteorological events, an intense or prolonged rainfall, usually high coastal and estuarine waters due to storm surges, seiches, etc. Another cause of flooding is, or natural cause of flooding is seismic activities. For example, tsunamis. Tsunamis may cause flooding by adding enough water that the addition of water or the rate in which water is added is higher than the rate in which the water recedes. The sinking of land due to earthquakes, and the uplifting of lakes and riverbeds from seismic causes. Also, astronomically influenced phenomena. High tides coinciding with the occurrence of heavy rainfall. If there's a high tide, there's a higher or more chances that a flood may happen in communities. Now, there are also artificial causes of flooding. For example, the first artificial cause of flooding is blasting. Blasting is a process where people use dynamite and explosive material to clear out areas. At this point, It may cause the materials to flow downward, which may result in unintentional damming of rivers and streams. And that damming will cause flooding in the areas where the rivers or the streams stop. Another cause of flooding is the construction of temporary dams. Dams pose as an impediment to the flow of a river or stream. And in times where the river or the stream is intense, well, it will cause an overflow. Another artificial cause is a failure of hydraulic or and other control structures. Accidents like the breaking of a dike may result in the entry of a huge amount of water in a protected area. Mismanagement of hydraulic structures, and lastly, the inundation of forests and watershed areas. Watershed areas naturally have a high amount of water. But if these systems or this ecological system is affected or changed because of artificial means, well, that will have a big impact to these watershed areas. Okay? So these are the natural and the artificial causes of flooding. And these floodings have two different types. First, we have a minor flooding. A minor flooding means that inundation may or may not be due to overbanking. Okay? When there is no bank overflow, flooding is simply due to the accumulation of excessive surface runoff in low-lying flat areas. Okay. When it comes to banking, it refers to river areas. We have a river and right along it is what we call as a river bank. Okay? Now, overbanking may happen when the river bank is too high, which makes the river too shallow. At this point, this area may be prone to flooding because it will contain a higher amount of water which cannot stay in a certain river because there is an overbanking. Floodwaters are usually confined in the floodplain of a river, along the channel, or random low-lying areas and depressions in the terrain. And floodwater is usually shallow, and there may not be a perceptible flow. In minor floodings, these are due to the overflow of rivers, due to the changes in the flow of water themselves. This overflow will cause minor flooding to low-lying areas or to areas near the river itself. And this flow or this flooding is not that deep and not that concerning. But what is concerning is what we call as a major flooding. A major flooding is caused by the overflowing of rivers and lakes by serious breaks in dikes, levees, dams, and other protective structures by uncontrollable releases of impounded water in reservoirs and by the accumulation of excessive runoff. When it comes to major flooding, there is a change in terms of the amount of water. Floodwaters cover a wide contiguous area and spread rapidly to adjoining areas of relatively lower elevation. Flooding is relatively deep in most parts of the stricken areas, and there is a highly perceptible current as the flood spreads to other areas. That is the main difference when it comes to the major and minor flooding. Major flooding is concerned with a higher amount of water as compared to minor flooding. Now, there are different types of flooding based on location. The first one is what we call as river flooding. River flooding occurs when large amount of rainfall causes a river to overflow. This type of flooding may last a few hours or many days, depending on the intensity and amount of rainfall and the carrying capacity of the river. The amount and the volume of water that the river can handle is a factor to consider when it comes to river flooding. So areas and communities near river are more prone to flooding, especially if these rivers cannot contain a higher amount of water. Okay? Next, we have what we call as coastal flooding. Coastal flooding may occur due to storm surges, high tides, and tsunamis. Water coming from the sea entering areas in coastal communities are the main cause when it comes to coastal flooding. And lastly, we have what we call as urban flooding. Urban flooding occurs in locations where most areas are covered with buildings or paved. In most areas where the ground is covered with buildings or paved, water cannot infiltrate to the soil itself, which is why water is instead repelled and collected above the ground itself. During heavy rains, water cannot infiltrate to the ground and accumulate on the surface. This causes what we call as urban flooding. It is also caused by the limited capacity of drainage systems to accommodate heavy rains. Which is why government officials and government companies, agencies, are actually making drainage systems bigger and bigger. Okay? Which is why government agencies should add a higher carrying capacity to our drainage systems to accommodate the amount of water that would otherwise be steeped into the ground itself. Okay? That is the main cause of urban flooding. Then we have the term flash flood. Now, when it comes to flash flood, this is a result of heavy rainfall over a relatively small drainage area. It happens quickly, with little warning. In areas where there is heavy rainfall and there is little drainage systems or small drainage area, there we will have what we call as a flash flood. And a flash flood will happen instantaneously and will disappear after a few hours or after a few days. But if the conditions are met, that the rainfall is heavy enough and the drainage system is non existent or small enough, then there will be a flash flood. Now, how do we best prepare ourselves? When it comes to floods, well, we look into flood forecasting. How exactly do we forecast flood? Well, we take a map and we look at areas that are prone to flooding. Okay? We look at the basin hydrological forecasts because we have in the Philippines 18 major river basins. The 18 major river basins are taken into consideration when it comes to river flooding. Okay, these are the 18 major river basins. We have Pampanga, Agno, Bicol, Cagayan, Pasig Marikina, Abra, Cagayan de Oro, Ilog Hilabangan, Halaur, Panay, Tagum Libuganon, Abulog, Agusan, Agus, Buayan Malungon, Davao, Mindanao, and Tagoloan. Sorry. These 18 major river basins are looked closely by Pag-asa to determine whether or not river flooding will happen near communities near to communities near these river basins. Then we have Angat sa Basin, Binga, Ambuklaw, San Roque sa Basin, Pantabangan sa Basin, and Magat sa Basin. If you've noticed, there's a status in each of these major river basins. These status are actually what we do or what Pag-asa does to forecast whether or not flooding will happen. At this point, for example, in Pasig Marikina, there's a non-flood watch, meaning there's no flood watch happening at that point, which means that the river level is relatively normal. Okay? Now, when it comes to a flood forecast, there's a Pag-asa issues what we call as a flood forecast. For example, in June 26, 2020, there's no flood information or warning for today. Now, for Pampanga River Basin and Allied River Basin of Pasak, Guagua, hydrological forecast, at present, what is happening right now? Right now, for the general weather condition or the forecast, there's partly cloudy to cloudy skies with isolated rain shower. When it comes to the upper Pampanga River Basin, its present river status is below alert level. The forecast in river trend is that there is no significant change, which means there's no significant hydrological impacts to the communities near the upper Pampanga River Basin. Unlike in coastal areas here in Hagonoy, Pambong, Malolos, Macabebe, Masantol, Lubao, Sasmuan. Again, it's the same. Partly cloudy to cloudy skies with isolated rain showers. But today is a high tide in these coastal areas. Unlike rivers, high tide is much more affected or much more felt in coastal communities. There's slight increase at riverside and coastal areas during high tide, which is why there is a possible of riverside and coastal flooding. River flooding and coastal flooding is possible to coastal areas of Agonoy, Paumbong, Malolos, Macabebe, Masantol, Lubao, and Susmuan. Also, there is a forecast that we can look at in the Pag-asa website. If we click in areas or in the website like this, or like in the bagong pag-asa.dost.gov.ph/flood/Angat sa basin, we can see a forecast for the Angat sa basin itself. Issued at June 26, 2020, valid until 9 a.m. tomorrow, there's isolated rains or light rains over the basin in the past 24 hours. The isolated light rains are due to localized thunderstorms. But the dam elevation is expected to remain in normal level during the forecast period. Okay? And there is a signature of the hydrologists that made the observation. Here we can see the Binga, Ambuklao, San Roque Basin. In this area, issued at June 26, 2020, light rains were also observed, also due to localized thunderstorm, and it is expected to remain at a normal level during the forecast period. We can also see the Metro Manila flood monitoring map in the Pag-asa website, where we can see different areas in Metro Manila that are and the warning status they are experiencing during that time. And in June 27, 2020, it was normal status for all of the areas in Metro Manila. Now, here we can see a flood warning system. Diba? We can see normal, alert, alarm, and critical. But what exactly does this warning system say? The flood warning system is a warning system devised by Pag-asa when it comes to flooding. Okay, there are 5 steps or 5 levels in these areas. Okay, the first warning system is flood monitoring. At this point, there is a slow rise in water level but still below alarm level. Okay, we must monitor for possible flooding in the area. Forecast: flood is possible, but there's light to moderate rainfall, and we are advised to take precautionary measures. At flood alert level, water level is continuously rising but still below critical level. Alert for possible flash floods and landslides at this point. At this point, flood is threatening us. There's moderate to heavy rainfall, and we are advised to be alert for possible flood, flash flood, and landslides. Then we have the flood warning level or red level, a flood warning level, which means that the water level is above the critical level itself. Flood is occurring and immediate action is recommended. At this point, flood is occurring and there's heavy to intense rainfall. And it is advised to take the appropriate action, evacuate, and stay at our homes and prepare ourselves for the flood that are currently happening. The second to the last level is the severe flood warning. At this point, water level is continuously rising above the critical level. Flood is persisting. Forced evacuation is recommended. And at this point, the flood is not only occurring, but it is persisting, or it is going higher and higher. There is intense to torrential rainfall. And at this point, there is an advice to force evacuation. After that, after the final and after the severe flood warning, there's what we call as the final flood warning. The final flood warning pertains to the recession of the water level. It is actually accommodated with light rains, and flood is no longer possible at this point. The flood is no longer rising, but is instead receding to a normal level. That is the flood warning system devised by Pag-asa. We have 5 steps: flood monitoring, flood alert, flood warning, severe flood warning, and the final levels. Now, when it comes to flood mitigation, what can we do to help ourselves during and our community during or before, during, and after a flood that is happening? What we can do first to mitigate floods or to prevent floods to happen is to regulate the cutting of trees. Again, trees contain mostly water, and they are actually responsible with the drying of ground themselves because of the action of the trees to absorb water in its roots. Report illegal loggers and caingeros. Report illegal construction of fish ponds and other establishments in waterways. Do not throw garbage in esteros and rivers. Help clean the neighborhood. Again, the capacity of the drainage system is what contributes to urban flooding. If the capacity of our drainage system is hindered by the pollution that we contribute, well, of course, we will be more prone to urban flooding at that point. Support community activities intended to lessen the occurrence of floods and avoid throwing anything like plastic wrappers anywhere which may clog or block the drainage system. When it comes to flood preparedness, what can we do before flooding? First, know how often your location is likely to be flooded and to what extent. Look at our history and look at where locations are more prone to flooding. Be familiar with the flood warning system in your community and be sure your family knows it. When it comes to communities that are prone to flooding, the local government unit is the one that are responsible to develop a self-warning system, okay, that may be transferred to the people of the community at a much faster rate as compared to a national warning system. Keep informed of, keep informed of the daily weather condition, designate an evacuation area for the family and livestock, and assign family members specific instructions and responsibilities according to an evacuation plan. Keep stock of food which requires little cooking and refrigeration as electric power may be interrupted. Keep transistorized radios and flashlights with spare batteries, emergency cooking equipment, candles, matches, and a first aid kit. And lastly, securely anchor weak dwellings and items. Areas in our homes may be affected by the flood because water in itself can move objects in our homes, which is why we should reinforce these areas and these items in our homes to avoid them being carried out by the flood itself. When warned of a flood, what can we do? Be alert of the possibility of the flood. If it has been raining for several days, it is more important to be alert of this possibility. Listen to the radio for emergency instructions. If advised to evacuate, do so. Don't panic. One thing that Filipinos and people of the community fail to do is to evacuate at a certain point. Okay? What happens is that if you don't evacuate in time, you will be stranded at your own home without any clean water, without electricity, and without any resources to survive. So, if you are advised to evacuate, it is better to evacuate to a certain area and go back to your homes after the flood has wind off or after the flood has receded. Store drinking waters in container as water service may be interrupted. Move household belongings to upper levels. Bring livestock to higher ground. And lastly, turn off electricity at the main switch in the building before evacuation. And also, lock your house. During a flood, what can we do? Avoid flooded areas. If you're in your homes, avoid going through flooded areas. Do not attempt to cross rivers or flowing streams because at this point we do not know the amount of water flowing and the strength or the force that the rivers or the streams may carry. So do not attempt to cross rivers during a flood. Beware of water covered roads and bridges. Avoid unnecessary exposure to the elements. Do not go swimming or boating in swollen rivers. Eat only well cooked food and protect leftovers against contamination. And lastly, drink clean or preferably boiled water only. After flooding, re-enter the dwellings with caution. Use flashlights or lanterns or torches because there may be flammables inside. Beware of fire hazards like broken electric wires. Do not eat food and drink water until they have been checked for food and water contamination. Report broken utility lines such as electricity, water, gas, and telephone to appropriate agencies or authorities. Do not turn on the main switch or use appliances and the other equipments until they have been checked by a competent electrician. Consult health authorities for immunization requirements, and lastly, do not go sightseeing in disaster areas. Your presence might hamper rescue and other emergency operation. Depending on the severity of the flooding itself, we must do our part in the community and contribute, may it be as small as preparing water for the family or preparing food for the family to as big as participating in emergency operations. That is how we best prepare ourselves when it comes to flooding. And that concludes our lesson when it comes to storm surges and floodings. If you have any questions, please feel free to message me in MSTeams at any point in the day, but the the answer to your concern may come at a later point. Thank you for listening in this lecture video, and I really hope that you learned something today while listening to our lecture video. Keep your best to stay safe and prepare yourselves for the future. With that said, I'll see you next meeting. You may now end the video.